Good morning. It's nice to see all of you. I'm Luci Draayer. I am the social worker with the Rocky Mountain Movement Disorders Center in the Denver, Colorado area. And I'm privileged to be a social worker there for probably, I think I'm starting my 14th year. And yesterday we spent a day as social workers every year. It's called Mandatory Training Day, and it's always a good time for all of us across the country to come together and make sure we're smart enough, make sure we know what we need to know, and keep learning ourselves as we work with HD families and individuals. So it's nice to be here. It's nice to see all of you. We're going to talk about staying connected and isolation today. And let me just this is live stream, so I have orders. I have to stay up here right by the microphone. Nothing to report here. All right, so staying connected and kind of fighting isolation. Why is it so important? You might be thinking and saying, you know, really, I have all this stuff on my plate, and now you're telling me that I have to deal with this too. I'm fine. You know, I've got Netflix. Can you just please leave me alone? I've got plenty going on. Why is it so important? Maybe you find yourself a little bit like this guy, and help me, stay away. You know, we have this kind of this push-pull thing going on, and it's normal for all of us. We get put in these situations where we know we want some space. We're not always up for being around other people, and yet at the same time, we want to know that somebody cares and that somebody wants to stay connected with us. And this is true for all of us, but I think with illness, it becomes especially true. I have a practice called Denver Counseling and Care Consultation, so I work with all kinds of people with all kinds of neurological conditions, and HD is just one of them. And this is a typical dynamic for all of us, but it's especially a typical dynamic when you're living with a condition or when you're the care partner or caregiver of someone living with a condition. So let's talk a little bit about what does the literature say about isolation. And the literature definitely has a lot to say about isolation as a coping mechanism, let alone isolation and its negative impacts if you're a person living with a health condition. So some contributing factors for isolation. Contributing factors mean what are some conditions that can add to or possibly affect how someone copes and lives and may tend towards isolation. One is employment. If you think about it, you don't even have to really like your job, but employment in and of itself keeps you somewhat connected, right? You might have to greet the receptionist as you show up for work every day. You might have to interact with a supervisor daily. You may have coworkers in a cubicle next to you. May not be the most pleasant of connections, but it is connections. You're not allowed to, in your world, to just shut down. So whether or not one is employed can contribute towards isolation. Driving, again, kind of a no-brainer. If I'm able to drive, I can still get out. I still have the option of being a part of that bigger world in some way that keeps me from just having the shades drawn at my house. Gender, what do you think? Generally speaking, men or women, who has a greater risk of isolation? Thoughts? Man, I hear it both ways. Tell me why you think women tend possibly have more of an issue with isolation. Whoever said that? Why do you think?
Because my wife is very happy at home reading a book, having private time.
Okay, so in your experience, your wife is very content, very happy at home. If she needs to kind of renew and rejuvenate, give me a book, give me a quiet corner, and she's just happy as a clam, all right? Who said they think men tend to have more factor towards isolation? Why? Okay. Yeah, so you're saying your partner doesn't need that many people, he's content being at home. The literature suggests that men may tend more towards isolation in these settings than women, because women traditionally, if you do your research, have more connections to people, a higher number of connections to people than men. That's just the way it is. It's neither good or bad, it's just the way it is. Both of your comments, though, I think are going to come into play here when we talk about personality in just a minute, because you're really touching on something. Rural versus urban living also seems to have an impact on whether or not one is going to tend towards isolation. And the literature suggests that urban living is better for someone in terms of preventing isolation because there's possibility that they have more resources. My caveat here that I think is really important is I've had a number of families from small town, rural areas where those small communities have really stepped up for some folks. There can be a very, very strong supportive care environment in small communities. Not always, but in some, that can rival what you have available to you in an urban area. So that's just the Luci thinking here, that it's not necessarily only urban. It depends where you live. And then finally, personality. So what kinds of personalities do you think might be a little more at risk for isolation? Any thoughts? Introverts. Everybody agree an introvert might tend towards more isolation? Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads. Okay, anything else? Yeah. Someone who's shy, yeah. Introversion does not always mean shy, but yeah, someone who's shy. So you're absolutely right. Those who are introverts can be at higher risk for isolation. I just want to say, though, that being an introvert is not a bad thing at all. I don't know if any of you have ever heard the book Quiet, but Quiet is a book written by an introvert about introverts and about the great value that introverts have in our society. Nevertheless, if you are an introvert, you probably have a few more red flags towards moving towards isolation when you're under stress or living with illness. The other trait, personality trait that tends to affect people and possibly increase the risk of isolation is disagreeableness. We all know people who kind of just tend to generally be disagreeable people. They're going to be people who may tend more towards isolation. All right, triggers for isolation. And so what I mean by triggers is what are the kinds of things that might tip somebody into isolation. So let's say I'm already an introvert, or maybe I'm not, and what can go on in my life that might kind of move me into that isolating pattern. The first is worsening symptoms. Illness is just in general, chronic illness is a situation that makes things more and more difficult for people as time goes on. And one of the things that happens is it automatically starts taking away the opportunity somebody has for interactions, just because of what's going on with the illness. So worsening symptoms, grief, and sometimes grief and loss is tied to what's going on with your illness. Maybe you have a medication that's no longer working as well. Maybe your balance is off and you're not feeling as safe getting out anymore, and you feel the loss and the grief of that. But sometimes it's grief and loss over things not tied to your illness too, that make you shut down and just become less interested in being out in the world. Research is starting to pay a lot more attention to stigma and illness. And I know that many HD families can speak to this very personal experience, the presence, the look, the way you feel others are perceiving you with illness. And then there's this whole issue of low self-esteem. In most of the illnesses with folks that I see, there's a period of time where people have to work really hard at remembering who they are, that they're still who they are. They're not a changed person. They're still inside at their core, a person of value and worth. But those feelings of being inadequate as your abilities change can become very difficult. Along with changes sometimes for people in body image. I'm aware my body moves differently. I'm aware I look different than I used to. And how hard is that to get out in public sometimes? So self-esteem can affect things. as well as, and this is a pretty big one, a trigger for isolation is the loss of a significant social support. Let me say what I mean by that. So it might be the death of someone close to you, but it might be something like a good friend moving away. I had a situation in the last couple of years where a daughter was very close to her widowed father, and they shared a lot of common interests in sports and sports events. He began dating and remarried, and she felt like she lost her partner in sharing all of those experiences. Now, they still had some, but it wasn't what she was used to, and she saw that as a real significant loss for her, and it triggered more isolation for her. So these are just some of the things that can be triggers for isolations. What's the result then? So loneliness is really the emotional feeling and the emotional result of isolation, right? Isolation is the physical aspect of what we do. We become less connected. We don't get out as much. Loneliness is that feeling that comes with that. One of the things that the research says is that lonely people not only remember more negative interactions, but they expect negative interactions. So if I'm feeling really lonely, I'm going to recall some past things that happened that reinforce why I shouldn't go out. But I'm going to expect negative interactions. When I go to the store, I'm just going to expect everybody's going to look at me. I'm going to expect the clerk doesn't really care to help me too much, even if it's not true. So once you get into this lonely frame of mind, it's hard to get out of it. When I was preparing for this presentation, I actually, in the Denver Post, there was an article called "What Does the Lonely Brain Look Like?" And it talks about brain changes that actually happen when one has prolonged, ongoing loneliness. So loneliness is a big deal to pay attention to. Increased depression. One of the things we know is that there is a very direct connection between isolation and increased depression. Isolation is depression's food. I think that's a very sobering but very powerful statement, and it's very, very true. The dangers of isolation feeding one's depression. Isolation is depression's food. And then we know that for those who have isolation on a pretty ongoing basis, there's decreased self-care and illness management. There's less healthy eating. There's less activity and exercise. And in terms of self-care, if you think about it, self-care can be things like, I know I need my meds at 8 in the morning, but why do I need to get out of bed? So, oh yeah, I guess I forgot them. Well, what does that do to your symptoms? I have that doctor's appointment, but I needed to arrange transportation. My friend wasn't available to take me. I just didn't have it in me, so I didn't get to the doctor. So you begin to see then how these trends in self-care just keep going down, 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 the more isolated and depressed someone is. And it results also in a greater use of healthcare services, especially in urgent care and ERs. And it makes going to the ER, right? It makes sense if you think about that. If I'm not taking care of myself, my immunity might not be as good. Something comes up. I've not been to the doctor in a long time. I'll just use the ER. Well, they don't know you. They don't know your symptoms. They don't know how to take care of you. So you see this trend in a negative way of what isolation does to an individual who's living with a serious illness. And then there is research now on showing that a combination of isolation and loneliness actually over time can impact you cognitively. You know, I work also with a number of older adults with all kinds of different kinds of health conditions. And one of the things we've always known is that undertreated or untreated depression in an older adult can look like mild cognitive impairment. It can look like early Alzheimer's. in some of these other neuro conditions, we're seeing the same thing. If you're not treating your depression as it's tied to isolation, if you're not making sure that you're not too isolated, you can start being more fuzzy in your thinking. So there's a reason to pay really good attention to things like how isolated am I. So before we talk about tips for staying connected, I just want to review a little bit about coping in general. This is a graph that I developed a number of years ago when I was working with people with conditions and illness, because I found myself drawing these kinds of things on the back of my notepad for families anyway. It has to do with what are some factors that go into that affect how you and I cope in general, okay? So this isn't complicated, it's not rocket science, but I want to review coping in general, and then we'll talk about how this, tips for avoiding and combating isolation play into it. So 4 factors that influence coping style. One is your core personality or hardwiring. The other is who and what has shaped you. And then the facts about one's disease diagnosis, current facts. And by the way, this also applies to care partners. So the facts of someone's disease diagnosis and symptoms have a direct bearing on what it means for that caregiver as well. The context of a diagnosis, all of that feeds into one's overall coping pattern. So let's just touch on these briefly a little bit. What is your core personality? I'd like to say that this is your hardwiring or my hardwiring, and just be thinking about that. What is that for you? As you know yourself, what's your hardwiring? Here's a few examples. Are you type A or type B? Do you tend towards optimism more or pessimism more? Glass half full, glass half empty? Are you more organized or disorganized? Here's that introvert, extrovert question. In and of themselves, these are all really neutral things, right? Who cares whether I'm more introvert or extrovert? Who cares if I'm more optimistic or pessimistic? A more feeling person or a thinking person? Some others that might come into play are you more spontaneous in how you live your life? Are you more planned? Are you more of a flexible thinker or a rigid thinker? Those are all hardwiring kinds of questions. Are you more stubborn or are you more compliant? It doesn't mean that you and I aren't capable of change. It just means that these are kind of more of our sets, our hard sets in our brain. Quick example, I have 4 children. One of my sons, Brad, is a CPA. One of my daughters, Leanne, is an art teacher. You can probably see where I'm going. A quick memory of mine as a mother, and you talk about hardwiring, is we had extended family in the South and would do periodic family reunions in the South. And I can remember there was a time when we did a family reunion in Orange Beach off the coast of Mobile, Alabama. And I think in that particular time we stayed in one of the motels or something, hotel somewhere. And it was several years later, I think my son Brad was in middle school, and we were reminiscing about that time with cousins, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes, oh yeah, this was him in middle school, Mr. CPA. We stayed in room number such and such in that hotel. I said, whoa. Contrast that with his sister Leanne, the art teacher, who even probably to this day could be staying in this hotel and may or may not remember her room number, even as the day goes on. It's hardwiring. It's just who we are, it's who they are. It's the kind of things that you could say, Lucy, change this piece about yourself, get going working on it, and I wouldn't make a lot of progress because it's just who I am. So hardwiring matters in terms of how we cope. Who and what has shaped you? We call this FOO, F-O-O, family of origin. So people like me who are also therapists, this is really an important thing. Key individuals and life's experiences, past and present, but this is often where people will tell me their stories, past and present, positive and negative about who shaped, including current people. We'll talk later about, obviously, for those living with a genetic illness like HD, you have an additional layer here, don't you? You have your generational story, you have your family narrative, you have your individual narrative. There's also life experiences and teachings. What were your childhood tapes? By tapes, I mean, what were kind of the unspoken lessons that a parent passed on to you? You know, always do your best. Work hard. What are some other childhood tapes? Save your money. Yeah, be frugal. We often learn our work ethic, for better or for worse, from parents. And it's often not taught verbally, it's just modeled for us. In line with that modeling, what was modeled for you about teachings from parents? I remember an adult daughter who, what her HD father modeled for her was how to receive care. And her memory was of her father going into a facility when she was a young girl. But there were extended family members who stepped up to make sure she and her other young siblings got to see him several times a year. And she has such fond memories of that because he was so gracious about receiving the care he needed, even though he needed to live elsewhere, that it taught her a lot about how to receive care. That modeling mattered to her. So modeling, what do people model for you, both positive and negative, that might be helping you cope today? And sometimes it's our negative experiences, right? That say, you know, because I saw this in my mother, I decided I'm never going to be that way. Or I'm going to work very hard to counter that because I saw how maladaptive it was for her. And then lessons on illness. When I get a new client, sometimes I'll say, you know, what were you taught about illness? And they'll say, what? It's not a question we ask. But if you think about it, we're all taught something about illness as kids. And again, it's probably not verbal. It's probably modeled. But it might be along the lines of, when you were a kid and you got sick, what was the response about going to school? You're fine, here's some Tylenol, you'll be fine. Or, oh, I remember my mom would let me climb into her bed for the day and she would bring me this and I got to watch my favorite shows. You know, even if I wasn't really sick. So I knew then that I could. You know, those are all lessons on how to cope with illness that go back to this FU, this family of origin. And then, like I said earlier, you layer on top of this the narrative of an HD family, of any family that has a genetic component to the illness. Okay, so then facts about your symptoms. Just bear with me if you are the patient with HD. How is your disease showing itself? That might affect how you cope. What is it looking like right now? Are you having more trouble walking? Is your balance pretty good? Are you having more trouble using your hands so you can't do your beloved work on your computer like you used to? That all affects how you cope. What are your specific medical challenges? Is the chorea getting worse? Is it well treated? Are you starting to struggle with swallowing? That might affect, again, when we get to talking about isolation and getting out and connecting with people. How effective are meds working? These can all play into your desire and your ability to connect and decrease isolation. This is also true for the caregiver. As things change in an individual with illness, in a corresponding way, it changes life for that primary caregiver, doesn't it? By the way, how many here consider yourself to be care partners? Okay, so we have a nice mix. There's always a corresponding aspect of what's going on. Whatever's going on with the patient goes on for the caregiver, only in a slightly different way. And then we have context. Context matters. What do I mean by context? Context is the all of the stuff surrounding illness and diagnosis. And I mentioned earlier that we have in this situation the HD narrative. So there's always a family narrative of illness, And there's always an individual narrative of illness. And when you have a genetic condition that goes down through the generations, that becomes even more impactful. So context matters. Let me give you some examples outside of HD. So for instance, someone who's having a stroke, for some people, they know in the moment they're having a stroke and they're watching the reaction of all others around them, the panic, and it traumatizes them. That's context. So they remain traumatized even after they're recovering. For other people having a stroke, they're not aware at all. And so they're oblivious, but maybe their care partner observed the stroke and they're the one traumatized. That's context. Context matters in the HD family, partly because it's generational. You know, what do you remember growing up? Context for someone who says, oh, I had 3 uncles and a cousin and my grandma, and I remember family reunions and symptoms I knew about HD from the age of 3 on, is a very different context than someone who comes to me and says, my mother was adopted, and until she started showing some symptoms, we never even heard the word Huntington's. Can you see the difference in context? So context matters. So you put all of this together and you get one's coping style. So let me give you a couple examples. So let's say you put a dependent personality together with someone who had a very helpless parent. So their modeling was more, I can't really do a whole lot. This illness is just here. I'm helpless. You put the dependent personality together with a helpless parent, maybe together with someone who's got significant chorea they're having a hard time treating, and maybe together with someone, the context of had multiple families members with HD, and they kind of have this overwhelmed sensation of, there's not much I can do. The overall picture of coping you're going to get then is one of helplessness. Why try? What can I do? That's one example. Let's do another example. Let's say you have somebody who by nature is an optimistic personality. They may be similar to that person who had such a nice experience of watching her dad model for her how to receive care. Maybe that person then has minimal chorea, not really problematic at all. And they live in an area where they had really quick access to care. The context for them was, yes, you're gene positive. We think you're now symptomatic, but you know what? We have all these services for you. Please connect with us. We're going to be your team. The result might be somebody whose coping style is to be very proactive on top of it. I'm going to work with my team. I'm going to do what I can. So you begin to see how all of these aspects affect everyone when it comes time to coping with illness, whether you're the caregiver or whether you're the person with the illness. So, back to isolation. Here's my point. Everybody should have a plan to combat isolation and loneliness, regardless of their coping style. Let me back up just a second. There's a lot of different kinds of coping styles. People can be avoiders, they can be angry copers, they can be passive copers. You could probably put together and tell me who you are in terms of how you think you cope under stress. There are people who can be very proactive and get after it kinds of copers. But the point is, regardless of what your style is for coping, every style for health really should have a plan for how to combat isolation. Whether you're the person living with an illness and you see changes coming, or whether you're the care partner supporting that person with illness and you see changes coming. You know, we're wired to live in community, even as introverts. Even introverts, you know, going back to the dawn of man, I guess you could say, we were wired to be in community. You know, the cavemen would not have survived living alone. And that part of us has not really changed. The other thing I want to say is that when we start talking about tips for isolation, there's really no easy solutions. This isn't easy. I don't want to make it sound like, really, if you just do steps 1, 2, and 3, you're going to be fine. This is hard. And it's hard because you see things changing. Chronic progressive condition, it means what it means. It's not going to go away, and it's going to get worse. But is there a way to fight the tendency as things change for your world to get smaller and smaller and smaller? So not easy, no simple steps, and there's no magic pill. So, and by the way, I'm going to be really eager afterwards. I think sometimes the best ideas of what people are doing to help themselves come from groups or come from what you've seen in other individuals and people in your life that had a good influence on you. So please get ready to share, because I've seen that time and time again, that groups like this really have really excellent ideas of what they've seen in other people. So let's talk a little bit about tips for staying connected. Identify safe places where others might be more sensitive to you. What would that look like in your life? What might some of those places be? The rec center you used to go to weekly? Church, synagogue, small little corner grocery where you quick pick up milk now and then, where the clerk has been nice to you. You're in a neighborhood where people have always known each other. What does it look like? What might be a safer place that you could identify where people might be more sensitive to you? The next is think of connection in broad terms, and this is really thanks to COVID. What did COVID open up for us in terms of how we connect? Say that once more. Yes, video. Yeah. Online communication, Zoom calls. Not perfect. Again, with illness, we're not living in the world of perfect solutions. But it has really opened up the ability for people to connect without being in person. I remember in 2020 when things were shutting down, and again, almost all of my practice is people living with serious health conditions. And I remember my intuitive gut reaction was, dang, I bet a lot of my clients are going to be able to handle this okay, because they've been addressing these issues all along. This is what they live with all the time. It's the real world that's going to find out just how hard this is. They've had to be creative about how to stay connected when they can't get out of the house. And it was true. It was true. It was true. Commit. Make a commitment. I'm going to try to connect with someone X number of times a week. We'll talk about what connect means in a minute. But sometimes it simply means saying, you know what, I'm going far too many days out of the week where I'm not seeing or talking to anybody. I am going to change that. This is what I'm going to try to do. Sometimes it just means, time to do it, I will do it, and taking a step. And then strengthen the relationships you already have. Is there a relationship you have that you've kind of let slide a little bit that you could pick up, that you could reach out to? Some connections you already have that you say, if I think about it, I think I'm going to do this. So-and-so and I used to do this. Or we used to talk this often, and it's been a couple months. I'm going to make this change because I can. I'm going to try to. Increase your moments of your micro moments of connection. This comes from an article a couple years ago, post-COVID, in Psychology Today. And I really like this, micro moments of connection. It might lead to greater contact. A micro moment of connection is a gift you give someone, and it can help with your mood. So one of the things we know about fighting depression is that if you can find a way to give to someone else, it can help you with your mood. That's one of the strategies for combating depression. And I want to tell you a little bit about Lawrence at Panera. So on my way to work is a Panera, and I have the Panera coffee plan where you pay like $12 a month, and you can stop and get all the coffee you want. And I go in there. And Lawrence, I've never worked at a restaurant, but I now know that there's terms called back of the house and front of the house. Lawrence is a front of the house employee, and early in the morning when I get there, he's the one in the front. And Lawrence clearly has a disability. I don't know what it is, but his speech is affected. I had to learn a little bit how to understand him. His hands don't always work that well. If you're in a hurry and you expect, you want to keep moving, that's not something Lawrence can help you with because he needs more time making change and getting things out of the drawer, going to get my orange scone off the bakery rack, and he's slower moving. But do you know, so I'm the receiving end of someone with a condition making a micro moment of connection. I bet it was about only the third time I went in there that he greeted me by name. I came in, he said, "Hi, Lucy. How are you doing today?" Now, did we become best friends? Did we get together? No. But he initiated a micro moment of connection that led over time to us chit-chatting. How was your weekend? Oh, what'd you do? How many hours? What time did you get to work this morning? Oh, man, how do you get up that early? And that's because on his end, in spite of whatever condition it is he lives with, he greeted me by name. He made a connection with me. And what I would go so far as to say to you, I'm up here talking about it because of how good it made me feel. I walk into a Panera and somebody greets me by name in a genuine way. That's what I mean by, are there ways for you to make micro moments of connection? Can you say to the clerk in the grocery store, "You know what, thanks for helping me today. It's a rough day, so thanks for giving me an extra hand." Or, "Your smile means a lot. It was a really long night last night." Those are micro moments of connection. Again, is it going to fix everything about isolation in somebody's life? No. But when I say you got to start somewhere, I will connect with someone how many times a week, that's a connection. I can't stress enough, use your HDSA resources. Go online, check out the support groups. See, again, thank you, COVID. Maybe you can't attend a support group in your area, but maybe there's one across the country that fits your time schedule better. Not in person, Zoom, but you know what? Better than nothing. It's a connection. No one thing is going to fix all of this. Check out Food for Thoughts in your areas. How many of you have Food for Thought meetings in your area quarterly? Those are great ways for people to be in touch. There's all kinds of things available to you. Check out broader general caregiving support groups. Just search it online, caregivers of any kind of condition. There's all kinds of things to look at there. And then give yourself permission to occasionally withdraw. We all need that. I think I fill my bucket when I'm alone. That's just how I fill my bucket. Other people fill their bucket by getting together with their 5 best friends. You could give me, whoever was talking about giving me that, my wife with a book in the corner. Yeah, give me a hot cup of coffee and my book. I'm happy as a clam for an hour or two. It really it renews me, and But so it's okay to withdraw. The issue we're talking about here is when isolation becomes a lifestyle. That's when the negative things start happening. Periodically evaluate your living situation. Now here's a tough one, but I am going to talk about it. Is your living situation too isolating? And I get into this conversation with families all the time, regardless of the illness. The point at which care at home may become too burdensome for what I call the whole informal care system. I serve on the board of a large long-term care organization in Denver, and its CEO, who I highly, highly regard, says even living at home can be institutional. Nobody ever wants to leave their home. But there are times when the isolation is so counterproductive as to be really, really a negative thing for the individual. I have a caregiver client whose husband has advanced Parkinson's. Bright man, very quirky man, kind of brilliant man in some ways, but very quirky. And their world was becoming just the two of them because the symptoms were too unpredictable. You can imagine the story. And something had to give. Something had to give, both even for the sake of, she was starting to have her own health concerns. Long story short, they made the decision that he would be the one to move. And she said, I'm going to try independent living with him because he'll never accept assisted living. I'm not sure we can do this. Here we are 6 months later. His Kaiser neurologist retested him on a number of things. His cognition has improved. He is out meeting and talking with people. She said, how do you reverse how he's doing on some of these tests? Well, you don't reverse. Don't you just get worse and worse and worse? And he said the number one thing that's doing it is he's with other people and he's engaged. Can he still shut the door to his apartment and be completely alone if he needs it? Yes. But is he connected with other people? And this neurologist has said, I attribute it to this move. And it's not that his wife wasn't doing a good job at home. It's just that his care needs went beyond what she was able to do. And one person can never meet that tendency towards isolation to avoid that. So I do need to put that out there, but it's a tough one. It's a tough topic. And then there are times when the best thing you can do is get help, find a therapist, call the social worker at your center of excellence. Say, I need help problem solving, or I know this is becoming more and more of an issue. Those of us at Centers of Excellence have limited hours. You know, the funding that we get from HDSA doesn't give us hours and hours to work with families, but HDSA does try to do their best in terms of making sure some hours available for people like me to have conversations with folks, to offer support and brainstorm. But think about use your insurance. Go to Psychology Today, findatherapist.com. See if you can find someone who's somewhat sensitive to health needs and connect. May not be perfect, but it's a start. You might have to educate them about HD. The other thing I will always say is for those of us who are Center of Excellence social workers, one of the requirements is that if I know of someone working with another provider in the area, if I know an HD individual or family is working with another provider in the area who is ignorant about HD, if that individual wants, my job is to educate that other professional about HD. And I have those conversations with attorneys, other therapists, hospital social workers. So that's one of our jobs, is to inform other providers and educate them about HD and how best to work with people like you. And then remember your worth. I can't say that enough. You're not your illness, you are you. Remember your worth if you're the care partner. You know, your identity isn't solely in caregiving. You are you, and you have tremendous worth. And try to combat that tendency towards low self-esteem or towards beating yourself up as much as possible. So here we go. We have a few minutes left. And again, within the context of nothing here is perfect, right? There are no perfect solutions when we talk about combating isolation. There's no perfect solutions when we talk about how to live best and well with chronic illness and serious illness. But that doesn't mean you can't take some steps in the right direction. There's a book called Tiny Habits. The professor's name is Fogg. I can't think of his first name, F-O-G-G. And quite an interesting gentleman, because he started exploring, why do we change? How do people make change? And I think we all know we don't make change based on how we do our New Year's resolutions, right? Right? The vast majority of us put those aside within less than 4 weeks. So he started studying, how do people make change that sticks? And he came kind of, if I remember the story right, he came on it kind of in a fluke by his dentist, who said, you're not flossing. And it was like, you know, we all hear that. Nobody wants to floss, and the dentist has said it repeatedly to him, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so he said to himself, you know what? Could I floss just one tooth? I thought, yeah, I could floss just one tooth. So he got it out, he flossed out, and he did it. He flossed one tooth. Well, guess what happened? What? He flossed another tooth, and then another. And it led to this whole study in how it's called Tiny Habits and how we change. And the research showing that the best way for change and to get change to stick is you start with one little thing. And that if it's done correctly, one little thing leads to another and another, and it builds on itself. So pretty soon he was flossing his whole mouth. He did the same thing, I think, with something like sit-ups. Can I do one sit-up? Yeah, I think I could do one sit-up. My idea here is, what one thing will you do that might enhance your connection to somebody? What one thing? Will you thank a store clerk? Will you maybe tell your cousin that, hey, it's been a while, I'd like to see you again? Maybe you're not ready to join an online support group, but will you at least research it? Say, yeah, I'll get on the HDSA website and just see what's out there. No commitment beyond that. That's okay. It's one thing you're doing that you haven't done before. What one thing will you do that might enhance your connection? I'm going to wait just a few seconds while you just mull that over for yourself. And then I will be happy to take comments and thoughts. What one thing? All right. Thank you for your attentiveness. Questions, comments, other tips that you've seen others use that might have been helpful or might be helpful? Anybody have any thoughts? Yes. Yeah. 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 Thank you for your comment. So the comment from a care partner is that you had to quit work and you lost that connection, and you also felt friends who drifted away, that loss, but that connecting with the therapist was very powerful for you, and you wish you had done it even sooner. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? What else? Yes. Yeah, so that's a tough one. So when your loved one deals with anxiety and medication doesn't seem to be helping, so that tendency towards isolation becomes even greater because of the anxiety. Has anybody else dealt with this with a loved one? Anybody else have any thoughts around this? Yes, go ahead.
Well, for me, I know there's strategies based on
Okay. So one of the comments is you try to assess a little bit of the kind of anxiety, and I'll have a couple comments in a minute too, to see if you can strategize around it. So instead of going to a party and announcing that 2 weeks in advance, maybe ask would they like to stop by. You frame it a little bit differently, okay? And go ahead, yes.
my brother.
Yes, so the comment is that maybe reevaluate the medications being used. Don't give up on that, but also combine with therapy. And so one of the things we know for mood disorders like depression and anxiety, the best treatment is often a combination of medications and psychotherapy or counseling, particularly what we call a CBT approach, cognitive behavioral therapy approach. The other thing is, I will just make another very general comment about medications, is that many antidepressants also work on anxiety. So it's a better cover than just prescribing the anti-anxiety drugs, which are not near as good to use. My other comment is, maybe for that person, social situations are way too distressing. But could you go for a ride in the car? You know, could you take a little, in my case, we would drive, I'd say, go to the foothills, and let's go to a McDonald's drive-through, and let's just to get out. Maybe a crowded situation or a grocery store or going to a ball game is too much. But thinking back to those tiny habits, what could you introduce? What could you try? And even if it's fairly solitary, at least it's getting out of the house. Any other comments? It looks like we have time, is that right? One final comment, or are we good? Thank you so much for your attentiveness, really appreciate it.